All right, we are going to begin the next session, and I'm going to do it by doing two things. One, very quickly, I will reiterate the fact that we do really want people's questions, but we actually can't handle additional lectures. So what we would really appreciate you doing is adhering to what the moderator would like you to do, and the default position for me would be, please ask your question. If you have context that you want to present, I would ask you to wait until the moderator asks for clarification. So please just present the question itself. That way we can get them all in and then maybe most of the answers. The next thing that I would like to do is read the statements that I mentioned at the beginning. We know that Shockoe Bottom was the epicenter of the U.S. domestic slave trade, and with its many slave jails and slave trader pens, it was also one of the very first examples of mass incarceration in the United States. And today we have solidarity greetings from two members of the Virginia Defenders who could not be with us today because they are incarcerated in the Virginia prison system. Hassan Shabazz, held at the Augusta Correctional Center, and Asghari Danso, who is in Red Onion State Prison, and are co-founders of the group Prisoners of Conscience and the Virginia Prison Justice Network. These are their statements. Greetings to you all. My name is Hassan Shabazz, co-founder of Virginia Prisoner of Conscience and the Virginia Prison Justice Network. As a lifelong resident of Virginia, I spent much of my childhood in Richmond's historic Church Hill. We would often visit Shockoe Bottom, but it would not be until later that I would learn that my footsteps had shadowed those of my ancestors who had been enslaved, bought, and sold in the very places where I had stood.
As a man, my more than 20-year journey through the Virginia Department of Corrections has made their experience more real to me, for this modern-day slavery of mass incarceration as a profit-driven industry is akin to the U.S. domestic slave trade, of which Shockoe Bottom was the epicenter. The need for a memorial park in Shockoe Bottom cannot be overstated. As we move forward to dismantle this system of mass incarceration, the 45 Virginia prisons constructed in the tradition of the Devil's Half Acre, aka Lumpkin's Jail, remain staunch reminders that in many ways it is all one day. These modern institutions show us that the abolition of slavery is incomplete. The fruits of this oppression, which sprout from the branches of white supremacy, are rooted in a struggle which grows from the bottom of Shockoe and must be memorialized in a way that will educate the people, empowering them to say, never again. To Governor Ralph Northam, Mayor LeVar Stoney, the City Council and General Assembly, let's bring this chapter in our struggle for freedom, justice, and equality to a close and do what's needed to make this memorial park a reality. This statement is for the Shockoe Bottom Truth and Conciliation Symposium from Virginia Prison Justice Network co-founder Asghari Danso. From the beginning here in Virginia, blackness was criminalized, thereby socially constructing the N-word and producing slaves who suffered an indefinite punishment, slavery. Contrary to common belief, the Union's victory during the Civil War didn't end this process, it merely changed it. The 13th Amendment was exploited by racist Southern elites through their bourgeois government, which wanted to continue the sociocultural systems that buoyed up the exploitation of black bodies through a special set of laws called Black Codes. Here in Virginia, the prison system excluded enslaved people until the end of the Civil War. In 1871, Virginia's convict leasing program reinstituted slavery under the guise of crime and punishment. Hundreds of my ancestors were literally worked to death by companies like Old Dominion Granite Company, now Dominion Power. I often wonder, where are their bodies? Are they at Shockoe Bottom? Since then, Virginia's corrections policies have found new ways to continue the exploitation of black bodies. Today, in the post-industrial era's age of super maximum security incarceration, prisoners' labor and consumer power are both being exploited. It is imperative that people understand that institutions of control like Monticello Plantation, Lumpkin's Jail, and Red Onion State Prisons serve capital's need to produce and reproduce its most exploited labor classes, the slave, the leased, and today, the offender. We stand with the Defenders and Sacred Ground Project in the struggle to reclaim Shockoe Bottom because we understand that the struggle to end slavery and the profit motive driving it still continues today. I am Gabriel, Anthony Burns, and Solomon Northup, in that I too struggle to end the exploitation of my blackness every single day. In unity and struggle, Ashe. I'm now going to turn the mic over to Christy Coleman. She is the CEO of the American Civil War Museum, and she is going to moderate this next panel. Do good.
Good morning, everyone. First of all, I just want to say thank you to Anna and the team for a remarkable symposium that's been put together today. And so I know that this next panel will add immeasurably to it, because we're going to talk more history, we're going to talk more impact, and then you will have an opportunity to respond to the wealth of information that is being provided to you by our panelists. And just briefly, to let you know who will be joining me on the stage, we have, and I'm just going through their names so you can look here on the back, we have Dr. Lauranett Lee will be on this panel, we have Lenora McQueen, we have Dr. Ryan K. Smith, we have, starting us off on screen will be Dr. Midori Takagi, and I want to make sure I'm pronouncing her name correctly. And last but not least, we have Ellen Chapman. So to get things started this afternoon, this morning, we're going to start with, are you there? Can you see us all?
Yes, ma'am.
All right. There she is. She will be laying the groundwork for us to really understand urban slavery here in Richmond. She is an expert in this area, and we'll talk more about that. There you go.
Thank you. Before I begin, I just want to thank everyone for hosting this symposium that acknowledges and recognizes the importance of African American community as part of Richmond's history, but more importantly, to recognize the vital role that Black Richmonders, free and enslaved, played in developing and shaping the city in terms of its very infrastructure, its economy, and its rich cultural life. The focus on Shockoe Bottom, a major focus of today's symposium, immediately demands attention to the African American community that lived in the area during and after the antebellum era. Because in the area surrounding the dozens of tobacco manufactories, iron foundries, auction houses, and the famous Lumpkin slave jail, free Black and enslaved African Americans worked and suffered, but also socialized, traded goods, frequented shops, worshipped, courted, married, and raised families in the alleyway houses and tenements. Black Richmonders, free and enslaved, lived in that area because of several factors, some unique, others not. First, a preponderance of enslaved African Americans had the ability to live apart from the slaveholders and employers. This meant that they were given funds by their employers to secure room and board outside of the residences of the slaveholders and hires. This is because in the urban environment, few owners or employers had enough room on the premises to house slave laborers. With this ability, enslaved Black Richmonders chose housing that was affordable and near their employment because there wasn't reliable public transportation. I want to also add that racism on part of white landlords blocked African Americans' ability to live in other places in Richmond, which also helped explain why they chose or why they were forced to live in the Shockoe Creek area. The ability to live apart was made possible through the unusual practice of hiring out enslaved African Americans. This was a system where slaveholders would hire out their bondmen and women to businesses and other households for a lump sum of money. Frequently, a lawyer might be part of the negotiations, but during the late antebellum era, slave brokers handled the contracts between owner and employer. In addition, A surprising number of enslaved African Americans were given the ability to hire themselves out to businesses, also known as hiring one's own time. They were given written permission from the owner to secure employment and find their housing for the year, and were only required to return to the owner in order to hand over the money owed from the employer. I want to add that this process of hiring out slave workers and hiring one's own time was critical to the growth and development of businesses and the government in Richmond. The two major crops, tobacco and wheat, were the mainstays of the city's economy, and they were cultivated by slave workers in the countryside and then processed and milled by Black Richmonders in the factories along Shockoe Creek. Nearly all aspects of those lucrative crops, which made thousands and thousands of dollars for the factory owners, for the white factory owners, investors, and bankers, was only made possible by the excruciatingly painful labor done by enslaved African Americans. In addition to being the main labor force for the factories, Black Richmonders also helped build the various government structures, such as the Capitol building, and helped maintain them throughout the antebellum era. So much of Richmond's architecture of the 19th century could not have been made possible without the sweat and labor of bond men. Going back to my discussion of the hiring out and hiring one's own time processes, those systems, along with living apart, gave enslaved African Americans a limited degree of control over their working and living conditions under the constraints of bondage. For example, under these conditions, individuals such as George, Richard, Manuel, and John, all enslaved Black Richmonders, were able to work in Ezekiel Wright's tobacco factory and live in boarding houses and rooms near the manufactory. Furthermore, after working hours, neither the owner nor the employer monitored the actions and activities of the bondmen, so no one was actively watching them. This, of course, gave the workmen a degree of physical and psychological space that helped them survive slavery. The systems of hiring out and living apart also affected other aspects of the workmen's lives, such as their meals and social activities. The workers could have prepared a simple meal in their rooms, or could have grabbed a hot meal from one of the local cook shops. Afterwards, they could have visited friends, or if they had the money, gone to a local grog shop, which is a saloon, for a brandy and a game of billiards. The men had to be careful, however, as they walked the streets, because even with passes, which are notes written by their owners or employers, which allowed them to move about the city, it was illegal for bondmen and women to be, quote, going at large, end quote, according to city laws. As I stated earlier, the development of this relatively unusual urban slave system offered enslaved African Americans a degree, a very limited degree, of control over their working and living and social conditions. Make no mistake, it was still slavery. Enslaved Richmonders were vulnerable to great acts of physical, mental, and emotional violence at the hands of their owners and employers. In fact, they were vulnerable to every white person in the city because of racial ideological beliefs, laws, and customs that relegated African Americans to being seen and treated as, quote, lesser than white Richmonders. But the urban industrial environment provided unique opportunities for enslaved African Americans to take greater control over their lives. The urban environment, for example, forced owners and employers to try other means of controlling bondmen and women, such as allowing them to find work, travel relatively unencumbered, and to earn extra cash through extra work or small entrepreneurial activities. It was these kinds of factors that enabled one enslaved African American by the name of Gabriel to travel between the countryside and Richmond to find work, make friends, and eventually assembled his plans to rise up against slaveholders in 1800. Gabriel was a blacksmith and carpenter who hired his own time and lived apart from his slaveholder. His ability to move around the city allowed him to attend religious meetings, barbecues, and market days, and helped him recruit members to his cause. On the eve of his planned rebellion, though, word of this plot was leaked out, and Gabriel, who initially evaded the authorities, was caught and executed along with 26 of his other cohorts. The vast majority of enslaved Richmonders, however, chose to resist and challenge slavery through a myriad of other ways. For a number of African Americans, just the ability, choosing their own marriage partner, that is, not having their slaveholders select their mate, and having it officiated in a church, regardless of their owner's opinion, was one method. Slave Richmonder Bartlett Holmes, for example, didn't seem too concerned about his owner when he chose Nellie, a free black woman, to be his wife. Coretta and her daughter, Betty, made arrangements with their owner to be self-employed laundresses, thereby escaping having a specific employer to answer to. Other enslaved women found cash-paying opportunities by taking on second or third jobs as cooks in snack shops owned by free black proprietors. This cash was vastly important because it was theirs to keep, and how they spent it was up to them. In fact, it was these cash-earning opportunities that enabled slave Richmonders to challenge slaveholders and Richmond white authorities in one incredibly enduring way, through the creation of an all-black church. After 20 years of petitioning, enslaved and free black Richmonders vied for and won the chance to purchase their own church, the first African Baptist church in 1841. Enslaved and free black parishioners were able to raise $4,500 of the total $7,500 to buy the church building. This enabled them to take control of the building and most of the administration of the church. Prior to 1841, black Richmonders attended the First Baptist Church along with white members, but they were relegated to the upstairs seating, which was small and confining. With the separate church, black members took control of all the pews, and the congregation vastly expanded immediately. By 1842, the congregation grew from 940 to 1,600, and by 1856, the membership was over 3,000. Though the pastor, Reverend Ryland, was a white man, which was required by law, Ryland gave a lot of latitude to the all-black committee of deacons. And it was these deacons who directly counseled members and resolved conflicts within the community. In fact, the church was seen as a type of community court where enslaved and free black members could express their opinions, seek justice, advocate equality, and be judged by their peers. This community court gave black parishioners the ability to hone negotiating skills and develop political strategizing skills that later helped them through the transition from slavery to freedom. The First African Baptist Church also offered opportunities for free and enslaved blacks to take the pulpit and preach to the congregation. A number of famous black orators of the 19th century, such as John Jasper, came out of that experience. Under and in spite of the constraints of slavery, free and enslaved black Richmonders struggled hard to create a religious, economic, and politicized community that, at times, threatened to erode the system of bondage and lay the foundations for a vibrant and rich collective ready and poised for freedom. Thank you.
How this is going to work is we're going to invite each of the speakers up to the podium, and then as each concludes their remarks, I'm going to ask them to take a seat on the stage. And once we are all together up here, we will have a conversation among ourselves and then open it up to your questions, okay? Got it. All right, next up, and thank you very, very much for those incredible remarks. So next up, we have, who do we have? Dr. Ellen Chapman, forgive me. We have Dr. Ellen Chapman is up next, and if you will come on forward, Ellen.
Good morning, everyone. So a little bit about me and how I approach this issue. I moved to Richmond in 2014, which anyone with much of a memory of what was going on in the city knows that this was high tide in number 3 of the baseball stadium debates. And this was the one that where archaeological sensitivity and the potential for destroying archaeology in the bottom because of the groundwork laid by the defenders and others became part of the conversation. And out of that, I sort of totally switched gears with graduate school, decided to write my dissertation on Richmond's archaeology and its potential community value. We started a community organization advocating for the city's archaeology. And now I have sort of continued to work on some of that stuff behind the scenes, and I also work in historic preservation law and archaeological law. And so I'm seeing that process of under what circumstances archaeology and historic sites get preserved or get investigated, and what the kind of landscape is for that. And so one of the things I think is really interesting about this moment in Richmond is that out of that debate came this understanding that Shockoe had this richness. Out of that and out of this, the Lumpkins jail excavation especially, that there was this huge archaeological potential in Shockoe. And a major theme of this symposium and the community-generated Shockoe Memorial Park proposal is the idea that this archaeology can be incredibly important, either as a means of learning or interpreting history, or as a public education opportunity for students and others, or as a sort of almost a forensic tool for exposing and making clear what was happening in Shockoe. And I think a lot of people had that moment when, I interviewed about 30 people when I was talking about the city's archaeology, and anyone who was around when that excavation was going on talks about the power of the cobblestones, of seeing that space opened up where people like Anthony Burns would have walked in the yard when they were able to take the air on those few occasions, or seeing the foundations of the building where he was held in fetters, unable to change his clothes, not given bathroom access. He talks about the horrors of that experience in great detail, and seeing those remains in the ground is something that I think a lot of the community conversations around Shockoe has included that element since that excavation. And so we now have an understanding of why archaeology can be useful down there, and part of that is experiential. It's this power of experiencing a place as some of the people who were impacted by the trade would have experienced it. So I think one of the things that obscures is the fact that we don't really know much about the archaeology of Shockoe. We've been talking about it outside of the Lumpkins project, the Devil's Half Acre excavation. We talk about archaeology in Shockoe more than we do it. And that enthusiasm among the public and the grassroots is not currently reflected in the actions and the choices and the protections made on a city level. We saw that mismatch earlier this fall, where the city almost granted a 40-year lease on a piece of property that City Council had designated for an archaeological investigation. During construction of the 17th Street Market last year, because of this additional attention on archaeology, there was an interest in hiring an archaeologist before they did that destruction. But what's interesting is that, I think there's an older attitude in Richmond, which is that there's nothing left. We're too late. Everything's been destroyed. It's sort of, and I heard that from multiple people. Really experienced, experts, historians, museum directors. Oh, well, it's too bad they destroyed everything in the 90s where the market is. But when they did an archaeological investigation last year, they found these two massive cellars dating from the 18th century that included a lot of artifacts from the period, throughout the period when the market was in operation. But that was, again, a decision that was made, a contract went out. It was very limited monitoring work, so, you know, a person is looking when the construction workers are moving the ground around. And what we found was something, but if we were doing this as a broader conversation, we were bringing more people in, we were having a conversation about how we wanted to investigate and what the requirements would be, we might have found a lot more. We don't really know. And that's the problem with archaeology, is that you don't know what you don't know, and then, you know, if you destroy it, it's maybe lost forever. So I guess here are my sort of broad thoughts about the archaeology of Shockoe now, and we can talk more in detail during the panel conversation about some of these topics and some of these challenges. The first is that currently archaeological discoveries and investigations in Shockoe are prompted mostly by construction projects, not research objectives. So they're kind of random. It's where somebody wants to dig a condo. There are a lot of instances, and this I find really problematic, and it makes me frustrated with my discipline a little bit, that there are multiple instances of projects that are left unfinished because the budgets were insufficient. And so then we don't have the completed projects, we don't have the reports, we don't even have the foundation of anything that we could bring to the public or that we could ask the public for their thoughts on. And many of the decisions about how and whether to excavate in Shockoe and everywhere else in Richmond and most other places, you know, other places, are made by non-archaeologists, you know, especially on non-federal projects where there's no legal requirement that people excavate. Many of these federal projects currently aren't involving the public. You know, that's something that you can incorporate as a required element. That isn't happening right now. And I think the issue with the lease sort of, it exposes a broader issue, which is that, you know, Shockoe now is happening in a lot of different silos across the city, you know, city institutions, nonprofits. There are a lot of different decisions that are being made, but we're not doing that with a lot of public investment, and we're not creating connections between some of these city institutions and non-city institutions and making a more participatory decision about a lot of these things. So that's kind of where we are now, and it's a heck of a lot better than 5 years ago when people weren't talking about archaeology as much in Shockoe. But it's sort of it's a process we're currently in the middle of. So I guess here are some questions that I think Richmond needs to consider and take action on sooner rather than later. And I think, as Dr. Blakey said in the earlier panel, you know, democracy and these projects are things that are participatory, and we all have to get involved if we want to see some of these things accomplished. So are we going to interpret the Devil's Half Acre? And what will that look like? If so, we've been talking about that for a long time. Are we going to prioritize the development of a public education program that uses archaeology to allow students and the public to learn about the interstate slave trade? Are we going to accomplish the goals of the Rose Center Fellowship, which was completed a few years ago in the city? And one of the things that they said that we needed was an archaeological protection code down there. And are we going to use archaeology more broadly as a tool to investigate questions about the persistence of some of these important places that in many cases have been hidden? I know Ryan and Lenora are going to talk more about this in the panel, but there are places like the graveyard for free people of color and slaves on the edge of Shockoe that have been presumed, like the market, like the first Africa burial ground, to be gone. They're presumed not to exist anymore because we decided not to value them anymore as a city, and we hid them and we let them be lost. But there's no, there's no certainty with that decision. There's no great research project that's been conducted that shows that that burial ground has been lost. There's just a presumption. And sometimes the presumption of absence when it comes to archaeological remains is a really expedient opinion that allows you not to look and not to spend the time and invest the resources. So, we can talk more in the discussion, but There are models out there. We can create an archaeological protection district. Anna attempted to put one through the old and historic district system a few years ago. There's just a lack of political will right now. And we need to create the political will through our own advocacy to these public officials, and we need to show that these archaeological protections are in the public interest, that people are hungry for them, that they will, in some ways, contribute to this idea of conciliatory practices that we need to reckon with as a city, why we have, no memorial park in Shockoe and no massive commemoration of that history, but we have all of these monuments, we have all of these edifices, we have all of these, financial institutions in the city that support various other types of history. So I think I'm going to finish up there, and I'm happy to discuss some of the details and the ways in which we could work on that with the rest of the panel.
I think thus far, one of the things that's really important to understand, as was laid out first by Dr. Takagi, is that, and then also by Dr. Chapman, is that Richmond's history is extraordinarily rich. And while our attention today is focused on Shockoe Bottom, we cannot and should not forget that Richmond's African American history is all over this city. And so it permeates the very fiber of everything in the city, the people, the stories, the realities. And so, again, I applaud all of you for coming out today to learn more about this. And as we continue this journey, we've talked about, the sort of the general space during the enslavement period. We've talked about what the ground is trying to tell us, what this sacred ground, and I think that name we all should appreciate, right? What this sacred ground has been trying to tell us. Here's something else that you may or may not be aware of. Recent research has suggested that almost 40% of African Americans alive in this country today can trace an ancestor that was bought and sold through Richmond. This is an extraordinary, extraordinary thing. So this isn't just our story and our responsibility to try to bring it to the fore. This is our national story, okay? So next up we have Dr. Ryan K. Smith, and as was mentioned, following him close is Lenora McQueen, who is so nervous, bless her heart. I think this is one of her first public engagements, but we're going to start with Ryan, and then Lenora will come to the stage as well to share a far more personal story, because at the end of the day, these are personal stories, not just academic exercises. Okay? All right, so Dr. Smith.
Thank you, Christy, and good morning, everybody. It's just an honor to be here and to hear what everyone has to say. I think, as Dr. Blakey mentioned, and as everyone here recognizes, burial grounds are essential sites. The presence of human remains adds moral and sacred dimensions to properties that can also tell us a great deal about the past. Such sites hold historical sources that can't be found anywhere else. Their ceremonies and their treatment have swayed political fortunes, enhancing the legitimacy afforded some groups while denying that of others. They have enabled communities torn by loss to reknit the fabric of society. And they nurture religious beliefs while offering encounters with the transcendent or with the ancestors. Richmond, as Christy mentions, has an incredible landscape of death, of national significance, among the most powerful in the nation. It began with Native American burials in settlements near the falls, remnants of which survive on nearby Pamunkey, Mattaponi, and Chickahominy sites. The founding of the city saw St. John's Churchyard displace those settlements on the highest hill, assigning Africans to the rough burial ground along Shockoe Creek that we're focused on here today. Some free people of color defied this destiny by opening their own groomed burial ground to the north at what would become known as the Barton Heights cemeteries, which served as a companion site to the city's second African burial ground, opened for free people of color and the enslaved in 1816, just up the valley. During this time, the city prepared the gridded Shockoe Hill Cemetery for its most prominent families, while the earliest Jewish cemeteries in the state opened first on Franklin Street and then at Hebrew Cemetery next to the poorhouse. Hollywood Cemetery and Oakwood Cemetery then presented a new rural landscape, a new model on the city's fringes, just before the Civil War transformed them into vessels for Confederate grief. After the war, the capital city then saw the federal government establish national cemeteries around its fortifications in tribute to the Union dead, black and white. And African American associations established Evergreen, East End, and Woodland cemeteries as a model for black uplift following emancipation. Race and racism framed each step. And that story goes on. Some sites, such as St. John's Churchyard in Hollywood and others, have been favored by governmental preservation policies and funding. Others, including nearly all the African American cemeteries in the city, have been actively targeted for destruction by developers, city authorities, and vandals. But we're living in momentous times. For a movement of recovery has been underway since the 1980s that's transformed this landscape. Modern stirrings began at Evergreen Cemetery, where National Park Service rangers like Jim Bell and representatives of the Maggie Walker Foundation joined alongside descendant families to begin reclaiming that forested site. Veronica Davis, John Shuck, Dolores McQueen, Marvin Harris, and the Friends of East End Cemetery, among thousands of others, have pushed that work forward. In the 1990s, Denise Lester arrived at the Barton Heights cemeteries and put together a coalition that raised historical signage, cleared those grounds, listed the property on the National Register, and held popular Whit Monday events at the historic site. There they uncovered some of the earliest African American artifacts still standing in the city. And in Shockoe Bottom, the Defenders, the city's Slave Trail Commission, and student and activist groups have prompted the removal of a VCU parking lot and commemorated the African burial ground anew as an essential feature of the region's history, while additional groups like Untold RVA have added to its programming. Most recently, Lenora McQueen has worked to reclaim the second African burial ground, which currently stands as an abandoned gas station. For the past decade, I've brought my VCU students to all of these grounds, along with colleagues and students from other universities, including the University of Richmond. Our students have responded to these sites in a visceral way, much more so than my other types of classes. We have tried to further the work along, creating audio guides for individual grave sites, doing research on the ground's origins and practices, learning from families, and surveying grave markers to create digital maps, some of which is publicly available. If I could just plug www.richmondcemeteries.org, that features a lot of the students' work there as a good place to start. And yes, we have pulled vines and hauled debris and trimmed grass, and when lucky, been able to uncover some markers. We've found that we can't understand one of these sites without understanding the others. In the 1980s, if we look at a different location, the city of Boston put together a public-private historic burying grounds initiative for 16 of its graveyards across that city. It found funding for research, for preservation, for interpretation. And recently, the city of Austin, Texas, unveiled an impressive master plan for all of its historic cemeteries. We don't have anything like that here in Richmond. In 2000, City Council put together a historic cemeteries commission, but no plan was implemented following its work. So we're left with a dozen vibrant local sites, all drawing on fresh energies that will help residents, students, and visitors see this city new. But we can't view them in isolation, and we've got to address the systematic discrimination that has left so many behind. It is the same necessary model that's been put forward in the community's 9-acre memorial park plan for Shockoe Bottom. If activity in Shockoe Bottom starts with the African burial ground or with the Devil's Half-Acre, it can't end there. And Lenora McQueen is going to show us how to keep that story going. Thank you all.
You left me. He's my support. Okay, I came to Richmond 2 years ago on a seek and find mission. I was trying to find my 4th great grandmother, who I knew it was possible who had been brought to Richmond by the widow of her owner, David Higginbottom. He was the owner of the Morven Plantation in Albemarle County, where my family, or that line of my family, was enslaved, or at least 3 generations of women in my family line. 10 years ago, I had a collaboration with Dr. Scott French and his class. A special class was formed to research the African American history connected to the Morven Plantation, which is now owned by the University of Virginia. I had contacted the university. I wanted to know if they had, in fact, taken possession of the property that was gifted to them by Mr. John Kluge. I also wanted to know if they had plans on researching the African American community that was connected to that plantation. The answer I received was, yes, the university has received the plantation or the property. Yes, we would like to study the African American community, but no, we have no idea who they are or were. My answer to them was, I do. They were my family. They formed a special class. Professor Scott French led that class. It was a small class of about 3 students, and the focus was researching that community, which I was invited to participate in, and gladly did. 2 years ago, I was given the opportunity to participate in a symposium, my first and only, and I wasn't any less nervous than I am now. I said yes, and that gave me the opportunity to arrive early to do some extra research, to find answers to some of the questions that were remaining from the research we had begun, I guess then 8 years earlier. David Higginbottom died in 1853. His inventory of slaves lists 56 people, which I was told originally were all by first name only. But in close look at that document, there was one person listed on that list that had 2 names, and one of them known to be my family name, my 3rd great-grandmother's maiden name, which was Carey. So Kitty Carey, who was listed on that list, was my 4th great-grandmother. And a study of letters that happens to be at the Historical Society here in Richmond proved that she was my 4th great-grandmother. But some questions were remaining. The 56 enslaved were to be sold at auction on the Claims House steps at Morven, which happened in mid-November of 1853. Mrs. Higginbottom, Mary Higginbottom, letter her daughter had written to another daughter in Philadelphia, explained that her mother, Mary, intended on keeping Kitty, my 4th great-grandmother, and 2 others. Whether she had kept her, I didn't know. It was revealed, though, that, or more research showed that, yes, Mrs. Higginbottom came to Richmond and lived where her daughters were. So I came to Richmond to try to find the fourth great-grandmother to see if those answers were available. And what I found at the Historical Society was a particular letter that was written by the daughter Elizabeth. And there were a few other questions, one being Kitty had a husband named Nelson who was owned by, he lived on another plantation. And the daughter Elizabeth, who wrote this letter that I'm going to read to you, she was trying to, in another letter, was trying to get her sister to join her in buying Nelson so that they could keep husband and wife together, because she indicated that Kitty was in great distress over the sad breaking up of her family. There was also a question of who a little Kitty was, who was mentioned in the letter. But I'm just going to read the letter to you. This is what I found at the Historical Society. And the letter is 162 years old. It starts, Richmond, 25th April, 1857. My beloved sister, sad is the mission this letter must perform, and you know I regret ever to give you pain. Still, as long as we remain in this vale of tears, these things must be. Our dear, faithful old Kitty is no more. She has had frequent seasons of sickness and suffering during the past 6 months, and often said she would not be with us long. Still, we hoped she would be better and stay with us some time yet. But God, who doeth all things well, had ordered otherwise. This morning, a few minutes after 5, she sent to my room to say, I must come down to her, that she had one of her attacks and was worse than she had ever been. I jumped out of bed and hastened to dress as soon as possible. Before I could finish, little Kitty came running to say her mother was dying. I ran down just as I was, as she drew her last breath. As I went up the steps to her room, the scene with Eliza, Emily, and Kitty I will not attempt to describe, and in addition to my own feelings, has so completely unhinged me that I am unfit for anything. Poor old Nelson is a picture of quiet woe. I should not be surprised if he did not survive her long. I stayed there and had her neatly prepared for the tomb. It was what she would have done for me. She had on the chemise which she asked you for some time since for that very purpose. I intend following her body to the grave tomorrow afternoon, and so does Jane. We do not intend any respect shall be spared to one who was ever faithful and affectionate. The few and only words she was able to say in the way of comfort when she saw her children weeping were these: Don't cry, children. Don't cry for me. I am going home. The abscess burst, and she suffocated immediately. Ma is, of course, much grieved. She and Aunt Eliza, with all the rest, send love to you and yours. Ma had been more unwell and feeble lately than I have ever seen her. Both she and Aunt Eliza have failed greatly of late. How is my dear little Leighton? Kiss him for me and give him his auntie's love and blessing, and to Louise and Nellie also. I have been very unwell of late and more depressed than I ought. Remember me in your prayers, that I may be better in health and more comfortable in spirit. Excuse the poor letter, for I can hardly guide my pen. Farewell. May God bless you all, is this heartfelt prayer of your own sister, E. Fisher. So that's the letter I found at the Historical Society, which brought tears to my eyes. After learning of that Kitty was brought actually to Richmond, and that this is where she spent her last few years and where she died, I attempted to figure out where she would have been buried. After receiving some information from the Historical Society, I was quickly able to narrow the burial place down to basically one, which was by some, being called different names depending on who you talk to. The graveyard for free people of color and slaves is how it's listed on an 1835 map. People presently, some are calling it the second African burial ground. My research seems to indicate since finding this letter, I have researched the burial ground and connections to it very heavily. I find that it is a segregated section of the Shockoe Hill Cemetery, though you wouldn't know it to go there, for it's not visible. The Historical Society gave me the address of the cemetery, and as being the corner of 5th and Hospital Street, and I immediately traveled there, but couldn't recognize it. I thought for sure I had arrived in the wrong place or had made some mistake, but I knew it was at the right address. It was some months later that I learned of your website, and I was able to confirm that the location I had gone to was in fact the correct place. And based on information that you left on the cemetery, I was able to contact him, and we've been communicating and collaborating ever since. There are many threats to the burial ground, both past and present. There's the widening of I-64, which threatens it, as the highway does run right through it. There's the railroad tracks, the high-speed rail project, the addition of a third rail. Those railroad tracks were laid right through it. There was the threat of 7th Street to be realigned with Hospital Street, which would also have gone through it, but the city decided to divert that street in a different direction and not impact the burial ground. There was also the threat that the original, or a portion of the original property, was to be sold. It was advertised in a tax sale, delinquent taxes. The hope is that the city will reclaim it, and I believe they're working towards that. So I think that's all I want to say for now.
Last but certainly not least is dear friend, Dr. Lauranett Lee. As you heard in Lenora's presentation and others, there's another factor here that must be considered, and that is the impact on children. Generations upon generations of children who were either stripped from their parents, who themselves were facing unconscionable cruelties, but who themselves will also grow and mature and make sure that we're here, right? So Lauranett has been, and there's one other point that I want to make, by the way, is that a lot of the material that I believe that you've been able to find was because of an extraordinary project that Lauranett did over years of work at what was then called the Virginia Historical Society, often without the due respect and recognition that she deserved for putting her heart and soul into creating the slavery database. And so if you have not taken part in that, I encourage you to do so, because this is the woman who has been responsible for helping us find each other. So with that said, again, I'm pleased to present Dr. Lauranett Lee, who's again been doing considerable work on the impact of all of this on enslaved black children.
Thank you, Christy, and thank all of you for being here today. Lenora, the research that you've done is just touches me, because at the Historical Society, where I was the curator of African American history, I delved into those slave records. I saw the names, the ages, the prices that were assigned there. And it's not the kind of thing that you let go at 5 o'clock. They follow you home, into your dreams. You have nightmares. You wonder, what happens to these children? What happens to these families? The mothers that are separated from their children, the fathers. And you think about what you see every day in our society now, particularly in a place where we have Shockoe Bottom, the second largest slave trading center in the United States. I think it was last year, Christy, that you had the symposium, or was it 2017? And that was the first time that I spoke publicly about the plight of children in the Civil War. And I looked at the ways that contemporary society still does not recognize what children are going through all over the world. We have a serious, serious problem, and we need solutions. And I really think here in Richmond, we need to look at the ways that this place and Shockoe Bottom itself can help us not only remember what children have gone through, to learn about what children have gone through, but to think about how we can help children truly thrive. We hear that word all the time these days, a thriving community. We talk about being inclusive, but how can we be inclusive when we have schools that are falling apart, children being shot down when they're attending public events in a park? How can we help them? How can we help families really pull themselves together? I'm just delighted to have the opportunity to represent the Virginia Humanities. We were just at a board meeting yesterday, and we're so proud to be able to be a sponsor for this, because what we want to do is engage the public in these hard subjects so that we can begin thinking about how we can bring about some substantive change. One of the things that we've done recently at the Humanities is to sponsor a scholar who spoke here at the Library of Virginia about Mary Lumpkin. Most of us don't know anything about her. Robert Lumpkin claimed her as his woman. He could not legally marry her. And what hardly anyone knows is that when she had her first child by him, she was 13 years old. 13. What does that do to a person? Subsequently, she had 4 other children, mixed-race children, that Robert was able to afford to send out of Virginia so that they could get an education. He was also concerned that should his financial status change, they could be sold into slavery, while he himself sold people. And when we say people, we need to remember it's not only men and women, but children as well. Children separated from their parents at such early ages that most of them didn't even know who their parent was. And so this idea of a surrogate family is something that's really a part of the African American heritage, actually very much based in trauma. Think about what this generational trauma does. Think about what we see in our society today. I was very pleased to read a report written by Dr. Matthew Laird and his colleagues, the James River Institute of Archaeology. It's called Remembering the Devil's Half Acre, examining the history, architecture, and archaeology of Richmond's Shockoe Bottom. Preservation Virginia was also involved in that collaboration. And the archaeologists looked at Shockoe Bottom and the artifacts that were gathered. And what really took me to another place was in that place, in that hellhole, There were parts of a doll, something that children play with, something that you would not think of finding in a slave pen, a jail, an auction house, a slave center. And you begin to wonder, who did this doll belong to? How did it get there? What happened to that child? What happens to any of those children? What happens to the parents who have to live with that pain? We know that kidnapping of children was something that happened rampantly. In fact, it was called blackbirding in the newspapers. They had a term for it. Children were moved around frequently. Boys were sold more frequently than girls. Girls usually were kept with a mother and an older female till about the age of 8 or 9. But as soon as they were able to reproduce, they were often raped, even before then. We know that on plantations, the slaveholders preferred to have more women and children because the women could not only work, but they could reproduce as well. Children could be sold and worked until they were sold. So we're looking at this loss of safety, very early ages. That generational trauma stays not only with that child, but goes forward into the descendant communities. After giving that talk at the symposium at the American Civil War Museum, I wanted to know more about what we can do to help children. And I was very fortunate to be a participant in a symposium that was led by Brian Little in Petersburg called Adverse Childhood Experiences, looking beyond adverse childhood experiences. And I learned about the 5 major personal experiences that children deal with now and dealt with in the past: physical, verbal, sexual abuse, and physical and emotional neglect. Then there are 5 adverse childhood experiences that they witness or experience from family members: alcoholic parents, domestic abuse, incarceration, mental illness, disappearance through death, divorce, or abandonment. So once again, we're looking at that loss of innocence, that loss of a childhood, that constant longing for family, that constant threat of separation. These children suffered hunger, dysentery, lice, fear, fatigue, overwork, abuse, neglect, witnesses of violence. When we think about plantations, we think about the way that Virginia has displayed itself with all of its beautiful plantations, but we never think about the violence behind those pretty pictures. We never think about what it takes to keep a people enslaved. We never think about what children see and hear and experience when their parents are sold away. They know that they could be sold away. They witness public beatings. They themselves are beaten. And they are worked and considered caretakers of little white children. And what does this do when you think about racial dynamics? That one should think that they are better than another, that one thinks that they are less than another. And how is that carried forward? We see it every day in our politics. We see it every day in the ways that our communities have been desecrated, our cemeteries, the ways that our schools crumble before us. And yet, children are surviving. We have to ask, though, what can we do to help them thrive? How can we move them past survival to thriving? Christy mentioned that 40% of African Americans today have some connection or ancestors who were sold out of Shockoe Bottom. When we think about that, think about the children. Think about those little ones, the most vulnerable among us, who had no voice, having to deal in a system that was so cruel, so oppressive, that oftentimes you would think they'd lose hope. But one of the first things that happened immediately after slavery ended, you began to see people moving around, formerly enslaved people, looking for family, because they knew that they were a part of a family, and they wanted to reconnect. How can we make those reconnections? I think this is a beginning here. Thank you to Anna and all of those on the team, the Library of Virginia, all of those who were working to bring out these stories, this history that had not ever really been told before. And when we think about what is happening today, we need to look at Richmond's place in human trafficking. We don't really think about it. We're comfortable in our lives. We work hard with our families, but Richmond is one of the major human and sexual trafficking areas in the country. In 2017, Virginia itself ranked 15th in the United States for most reported cases of human trafficking. A year later, 2018, Virginia ranked number 14th in the United States for most reported cases. What is this telling us when we claim to be Virginians and so proud of our history, yet we would let something like this happen? And because we're at the intersections of Interstates 64, 95, and 295, it makes this city an attractive place for traffickers to do business, specifically ranking in the top 20 of the most prolific cities for trafficking. The average age of entry into prostitution is between 11 and 14 years old for both boys and girls. Think about that when you think about Shockoe Bottom and the trafficking that went on there. Traffickers profit approximately $150 billion each year, and that's more than Nike, Starbucks, and Google combined. Think about where we are in this intersection. And we know that it's one of the fastest growing criminal industries in the world. We hear a lot now about the children at the borders, and we are very concerned about that. We need to be. We need to always remember the children here that were in Shockoe Bottom. We must never, ever forget. This veil of tears will never go away until we do something. Thank you for listening.
So now we will start taking questions. Given the time, we want to just move into questions at this point. But clearly, as has been said often, history is present. And frankly, we will never get right with each other if we cannot get this history right. And we'll continue to see these patterns play out in our lives and on our streets. So let's get to work. But before we do that, again, I'm sure that there are a number of questions, so if you will line up along the aisles, we will begin that work. of taking in the next questions. I had told Anna I was going to try to get us back on schedule by finishing at 12:30. I don't think that's going to happen, so we'll compromise at 12:40 and go from there. Thank you. I'll start right here. Yes.
Considering in times of scarcity and fear of survival, these policies are stronger, are there any work that is being done for the environmental impact that's going to happen and the economic impact it's going to have on humanity in general? And what policies in the past that we've observed in how wealth was redistributed, and what can we learn so that we can prevent it in the new times of stress?
Okay, I think what I gleaned from your question is really about an interdisciplinary understanding. There's certainly been recent research that says that when we recognize that the poor, the working poor, who more often than not are people of color and black communities, are going to be far more susceptible to climate and environmental change because of the way that their communities are segregated out, because of the way that literally, they just recent study that in urban centers that are predominantly black, there are less green spaces, which makes them hotter, which makes people more susceptible to asthma and all kinds of respiratory illnesses and so forth. And then if you add to that lack of access to care, and sometimes that care, especially as it relates to black bodies, either believe that we are more able to endure pain compared to white people, which is really something that the medical community is trying to grapple with, ignoring the pain of black bodies, or thinking that the people who are presenting are somehow faking it. And so all of these issues, you're right, are sort of legacy issues to a certain degree. These are legacy issues. So, but I do want to bring us back to the overall question and the way that we can think about this. So let's think about, I'll start with you, Ellen, actually. I'm gonna glean a question out of this for you. In the archaeology, especially when finding human remains, and I know Michael has written about this as well, the things that we find in terms of trauma on the bones, on the remains of the enslaved that we find in these cemeteries that have been excavated. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. And just more broadly about the original question, too, I think what she was kind of getting at is environmental justice. And that's been something that's been on the rise, this recognition that bad impacts happen disproportionately to poor communities and communities of color. In Virginia, there's a council on environmental justice. It was started up, it was then let fallow in the wake of the governor's blackface scandal. It was brought back. That is a place where if you know that you have an environmental issue that is disproportionately happening to a community of color, or a cultural issue that's happening where cultural remains and archaeological sites and historic properties associated with communities of color are not getting the attention they should get. That's an environmental justice issue, and there is, there's legal precedent, and there's now this council to address things like that. So just, that's one avenue. In terms of trauma on skeletons, you're totally right that Dr. Blakey would be a better person to address this than me. But I think the key is that there are certain things like broken bones or damage that you can see certainly forensically, and there's also things like metabolic stress. So when Lauranett was talking about the life of children and what happens to children, you can see the life cycle of stresses and illness and insufficient nutrition on the teeth, because when they're mineralizing in the child, their growth gets stopped because the amount of problems is so severe. And that trace, these hypoplasias in the teeth, is present in a lot of historical communities because it was often hard to be a child in the past, but the rates at the New York African Burial Ground and other examples of enslaved communities in Alabama as well, you could see that stress on the bodies. And so I think maybe that's one way in which Richmond generally has gotten more interested in archaeology because of things like the Remembering Slavery Project and because of the New York African Burial Ground. Like, especially when I was interviewing people about Richmond's archaeology, especially when they were a person of color, they often said that the New York African Burial Ground was one of their first entrees into archaeology because it was archaeology that was relevant to an issue they cared about and made them sort of see how archaeology could teach them things that had resonance in their lives.
Next question. We're going to take the next question.
My name is Frederick Fisher, and I have a question for Dr. Chapman. Shockoe Valley is a place that everybody wants to develop it. And from an archaeology standpoint, are existing plans, I know you said there is no money, are there existing plans of what should be done? And is there somebody leading the charge to apply for grants from state and federal as well as the city?
So I don't know that I said that there's no money, but it's certainly true that that Shockoe is under a lot of development pressure. There are certain entities that have been set up recently, like the Shockoe Alliance, where the goal is to create a small area plan for that part of the city to provide development guidelines. So that the Shockoe Alliance process is strictly advisory, and so I think one of the keys is to ensure that there's support for its conclusions. But absolutely, that's one of the processes that's going on in the city. There's also, and I have, I think, a sign up here. When the baseball stadium was happening, there was a group of which there are several members here in the audience today that started called RVA Archaeology. It was founded by Terry Brock and myself and Kim Allen, who's an anthropologist from UNC. And the goal of that group is advocacy and education around the city's archaeological resources. So if you'd like to come up and talk to me about that afterwards, I'm happy to, and I'll send around the sign-up sheet.
Thank you. Yes.
Thank you.
Oh, yeah, you can adjust.
Sorry, a little short there. Today and in the last few years, we've heard a lot about plans, suggestions, and hopes. Plans for cemetery preservation, suggestions from the Monument Avenue Commission, hopes for an archaeological protection order. What is the best way for us here today and the Richmond community in general to advocate to the city government for truth and conciliation? Is it in our time volunteered, our money, and individual advocacy? What is the best way that you see for us to come together to advocate for this?
Dr. Smith or Lauranett, you all want to take that question?
I believe today is a very good beginning. We need to take this momentum and really develop some strategic ways to move forward and talk with those who are in positions to really make some difference. We'll talk during lunch. That's good, that's important. That's why we're here. But we need to start developing strategies to move this forward. We need to do it with all deliberate speed because we're losing too many people. And I really see the ways that different cultural institutions are collaborating and coming together. And if we can make sure that those who are in positions, I hesitate to say positions of power, but positions of influence, thank you, that can put money behind doing something that's collectively uplifting and helping people understand this history, not just from a textbook perspective, but from that experiential living experience. So that if you were to go to Shockoe Bottom and actually look into the spaces where these people were enslaved, if you were to engage children in the ways to think about play, having green space, growing food, learning to read, learning to work with people who have their best interest at heart, making sure that they know that they are cared for, that they are loved, and that there is hope for them to have a better life than many of them know of or are surrounded by now. Because so many are living in poverty, not only financial poverty, but emotional poverty. Where are the arts and culture for these children? Where's the opportunity for them to really, truly thrive? Let's think about who we need to talk with who are in positions of influence to make that difference.
And I think when we're talking about money and the like, it's always so much easier to go, well, why don't they give? You fail to understand the power of collective. You know, think about the power of 1 million people giving $1 versus what happens when one person gives 1 million. What really happens in terms of the difference? You see what I'm saying? So don't dismiss, don't put it off on somebody else, don't look for some other developer. You put your money where your mouth is, even if it's just $1, because it is never just $1 when it's collective. Next question.
So I don't even know where to start. So much is racing through my head about things that we have to do after today. I know that my family is descendants of Gabriel. We know we've experienced generational trauma, Dr. Lee. Gabriel saw his father die. Gabriel's son, Samuel Joshua, saw his father, well, he was a baby. He was sent out of state as a baby when his father was hanged, and then he was made a breeder slave. All of that is trauma. So I'm upset to even think that the city of Richmond is going to desecrate yet another African American cemetery, burial ground. And I'm really frustrated because I joined preservation groups. I'm an environmental engineer. I've been on development projects. I've been in preservation groups. I've lived in every southern state except Arkansas. This is not a new experience to Richmond. We have to prioritize making this right. And it frustrates me to hear, well, there's no archaeology ordinance. Well, there's NEPA. And I don't understand the National Environmental Policy Act. And I don't understand how Richmond has, and VCU, I'm sorry VCU, have been getting away with paving things and buying things without environmental impact.
Okay.
This is so that's my question for the archaeologist. Right. And then my second question is,
oh, you got one.
The money.
I'm going to give you one.
The money.
We're going to give you one. Ryan, I'm going to put you on the spot. Go ahead.
Hey, I'm not going to defend any of those policies by VCU. That's the beauty of tenure, right? I can. We look at Sean Utze. You know, there's no better advocate for this kind of work than Professor Sean Utze, who's called attention and really helped. Back to the question that we got before: how do you get groups to do the right thing? It takes a number of different levels to do that. And even coming from voices within VCU, Sean Utze calling on the conscience and making those demands of the institution to actually step up and try to rectify some wrongs that took place there.
Where is the need?
Yeah, we're talking about the site that's still under threat here, just down the valley at 5th and Hospital Street. That's the future of that site is still uncertain. Before Lenora was able to find it on the city's tax rolls for sale due to tax delinquency, it might have been sold back into private hands, from one private hand to another private hand, as recently as just last year. The city was not aware of what it had. The Department of Historic Resources here didn't know what it had. Previous studies had minimized that site. If you go all the way back to 1960, when the city divested itself from its property into private hands, it claimed that it had no records of burials there at all, which is incredible to see, because here we are at the Library of Virginia. Archivists have been able to point us to registers of burials on that particular site. And so what needs to happen there going forward is this process that we're all building towards here in this room, and that we've seen the Defenders and other groups focus, and the Friends of East End focus on all of these very critical sites around town. I don't know, Lenora, what do you want to say about the current status or anything like this?
Well, I guess what had just come to mind was I wanted you to mention how many people we believe were buried at the site.
Well, yeah, you asked the question about the site's future. What research I've done might suggest that this is the largest site in terms of numbers of burials of enslaved people in the nation. It was in operation from 1815 through 1879. It was the primary burial ground for people of African descent after the so-called burial ground for Negroes in Shockoe Bottom was closed. There was the Free African burial ground north of town at Barton Heights, but that was a much smaller number of the population. And so we estimate that the numbers were comparable to the white burials in Shockoe Hill Cemetery. We do have some records that show that those numbers align. So we're talking about over 21,000, 22,000 possible burials there that have essentially been obliterated and erased from our public memory and our recognition.
Burials were regularly reported to the City Council. There was a standing committee, the Shockoe Hill Burying Ground Committee, that oversaw not just the white burial ground, but also the black burial ground. And in looking at those numbers, well, some estimations had to be included, but looking at those regular reports, I think it's a very conservative number to say that those burials probably exceeded 22,000 people.
All right, we have two more questions, and then I believe a comment from Dr. Michael Blakey. So, yes, sir.
I'm not really from here, but my hair but Shockoe slip, and I don't know nothing but no Shockoe slip, because this thing could have been out here 100 years before anybody was born here. Okay, and you'll probably talk to your ancestors or something, you know, but I don't know your people's ancestors, but and you're talking about as I heard about my history books, and I study my history books, you know, and you'll talk about colors, you know, but I understand what colors mean, you know. You look on a wall, what colors mean, you know. That's showing that somebody is now welcoming your door. That what color mean. I mean,
so what's your question? What
okay,
the question do you want for us?
Okay, I want to say some people say new generation out here. Some people say old generation, you know. So we all looking at each other different one another, you know, like generations. So, well, some people been in racism. Some people never ever been in racism. So, I'm just trying to say, I'm hearing a different thing, but colors, some people is free, some people is not free, so everybody's got their own situations, okay? And some people are rich, some people is poor, so nobody know who is who. So I'm just trying to say that, I'm a taxpayer, I work hard for my money, I'm a taxpayer, and some people could vote, some people can't vote, but I'm a taxpayer. I worked all my life for my money, and but they need to change something around, you know, like that computer thing, because nobody want to give up no job because that computer stuff messing everything up. That email address, I think the application was the best thing in the world. If you could turn that back around, give other people a chance to fill out an application, because everybody can't fill out that. I feel like that's a game. You know, like Amazon, they hiring, they hire you from a computer, but everybody's not doing it. Like hire you from the computer, you know.
Understood. Okay, thank you. I thank you.
Okay, now I want to say one more thing.
No,
but
we're gonna
homeless
let
people.
You want them to, okay, go ahead. I'm
Okay,
sorry,
like,
brother, go ahead.
A lot of homeless people on the street, you know, and anybody could be homeless, you know. You need to turn that thing around and let people, get people in the door, like, get other people in the door, you know, Section 8 or something. Don't let everybody be a bum on the street now. Anybody could be a bum on the street now, you know. I see a lot of people begging for money. I see a lot of graffiti wrote, you know, on the wall. I don't know who's doing it, but that's what I gotta say.
Thank you. Okay, thank you. All right. Last question and then last question, comment.
My name is Shannon. I had recently done a personal genealogy and had uncovered an incredible legacy. My three times great-grandfather was America's first Reform rabbi out of Charleston, South Carolina, and a lot has come with that regarding the Jewish community there. And I've scratched a little bit of the surface here about Richmond and the origins of Jews in Richmond, and Shockoe Bottom is definitely, and I've only scratched the surface. My question to you, all of you, have you had any support from other like historical communities or communities that were part of the, frankly, that were either perpetuated or were part of the 19th century Shockoe Bottom? Have you had any, like for instance, the Jewish community, has any of the archivists there assisted and supported you guys? And if not, how can I get them involved?
So the Beth Ahaba Museum and Archives here in
Yeah.
town, Congregation Beth Ahaba is the primary Reform congregation that dates back to about 1841, 1844 or so. They've got an exhibit up right now in their museum and archives that deals with Jews in Richmond during the Civil War, and they're very frank about the fact that a large proportion, as among the white Gentile population, were slave owners and certainly supported the Confederacy as well. So I think they do a good job there at the museum of acknowledging those responsibilities and that legacy. However, when it comes to the landscape itself, there has been times when, frankly, Hebrew Cemetery has benefited from expansions over what appear to be African-American graves.
Right.
And we are still, frankly, hoping for a little bit more acknowledgement or assistance along those lines, as we would with the city, with Shockoe Hill Cemetery as well.
Got it. Okay, I appreciate that information.
And last but certainly not least.
And how did you know it was a comment question?
Known you a long time.
But they're really, for me, a major question. It's a question that I struggle with quite often. And I think it has to do with another elephant in the room that's related. That is, for me, the most explicit, systematic denigration and demoralization of children. And it's in all of our hands. We allow it. We pay for it. And it comes from, so I would, entry to this, in a lot of places they entered this. You know, the Remembering Project found this as we surveyed the state. There's other evidence. You know, the space in education is filled by Chaucer and Gilgamesh. Some of that's interesting. But there's too much of it. Mm-hmm. Whiteness fills the space of history. We were sent when we began to inquire why there are no textbooks. And the white women teachers are afraid to teach what little they know. We were told it's in the SOLs. It is in the SOLs, African and African American history. Clearly, a community has fought for this. It is not taught. It is not taught, and it's the systematic, perpetual denigration of black people in this state and elsewhere. And I just finally would say, as a comment, when I was 17, in high school, in Washington, I could take I took 2 semesters of Kiswahili. I took black literature. and other aspects of African American and African culture and history. It inspired me to go and be involved in study groups where I read Fanon, and to, in a black university, continue to study African American archaeology and the like. It made me whole. However whole you may think I am, I hope you recognize it. That's what it does. And it is denied because we protested as students at the school board meetings on a regular basis. We stood up and demanded what is everyone's human right. And my question is, why don't you?
And we will end on that because that question is for you to answer for yourselves. On behalf of the panel and another very special thank you to the Sacred Ground Project, Anna and the team, thank you for having us.
So while we gather for just a second, I would like to recognize, just a moment, please. Thank you. I'd like to recognize that our city's mayor, LeVar Stoney, has joined us, and he has been here for this session, and we would like to invite him up to say a few words before he departs. I think the cases have been laid before you.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I am sorry I am in my attire. I have my Christmas sweater on. I was at the Christmas parade. I stepped off the parade roof right here at the Library of Virginia, and I want to appreciate the invitation from Anna for having me this afternoon to sit in and also provide some brief remarks real quick. First, I want to thank our panelists as well. I think we take for granted the education I think that all of our citizens need when it comes to our history. At times, we have been the city has been the portrayers of just one history, not two, but just one history. And you can see that all around us here in the city of Richmond. For example, Ms. McQueen, you made me privy to an email some time ago about the burial site off of Hospital Street. And it was brought to my attention, and that's why we sat down with those involved in the Department of Public Works to divert that road that was going to be paid for safety reasons, because they did not know at all about the history that belonged there. And also the work we're doing with the tax delinquent property there, that gas station there at the corner of Hospital as well. And this year we've obviously embarked on the work on Shockoe Alliance too, bringing all parties, all those involved in Shockoe Bottom to the table, one of the first time efforts ever, bringing everyone to the table to fix the problem. And that is, why haven't we done anything in all these years? You know, I got a chance to go home for Thanksgiving and sit down with my family and talk about my work. And sometimes, yes, it is challenging. Richmond is the home of all things good, bad, and ugly. That's our history. That's our history. But we have an opportunity today to do better. Do better. That's all that I think the residents of this city, the citizens of the city request of their leaders, those involved, is for us to do better. And as Maya Angelou stated, do the best you can until you know better. And once you know better, do better. And we have the opportunity before us to do better. And that's what I will leave you all with today. We do have an expectations for our leaders to do better, but they don't do better without people behind them and people holding them accountable as well. I come here today.
For the Memorial Park, yes or no?
Okay, all right. All right. Phil Waledo, we will talk later. We will talk later.
There's no better time than now. Are you for it or against it?
Phil, we've talked about this before. Let's not act like this is new. We've talked about this before. We've talked about this before. Here's the thing. Folks are in agreement that we should preserve and memorialize the enslaved Africans who lost their lives and were trafficked in Shockoe Bottom. Do we all agree on that? Yes. There are some folks who are for simply one thing, and that is just, I want to go into a facility and actually research my answers. Yes, we should do that, but we should do more as well. We should preserve the era. We should begin with history, not with economic development. And that means tackling all the challenges down there, whether it's the stormwater issues that may be down there as well. There's an environmental and economic way to tackle all those things in Shockoe Bottom. And people say, just do it. Well, ladies and gentlemen, to do it, dollars just don't fall from the sky. And I love what Ms. Coleman said. It's going to take money. It's going to take money. And guess what? This city government is responsible not for just what happened yesterday. We're responsible for what happened today and tomorrow. And tomorrow. That means the crumbling schools that your kids go to, we're responsible for that today. We have to reverse what our predecessors did. We have to, or didn't do. Thank you, sir. Or what they didn't do. And what they didn't do. But guess what? That costs money. And so when I propose tax increases on this city, folks say, oh my gosh, Mr. Mayor, you're going to tax me out the city. But guess what? It's one thing to have a value. You're going to have to pay for those values as well. So when I hear folks say, oh, I'm progressive and whatnot, I'm pro this, I'm pro that, you have to pay for that. You have to pay for it. And so we want a memorial park, we want a facility, we have to pay for it. Now, I'm telling you today, I'm willing to do what's necessary to go to the mat and see it through.
It's archaeology and get that paid for.
We can do that as well. No one said that. Here's the thing. I don't have a vote on the city council, by the way. All right? I don't have a vote on the city council. So you get 5 members behind me, we get things done. All right? Get it done.